All right, guys. Good afternoon. Thanks for making time on a sunny Saturday, maybe the last of the year, for a conversation on just transition. I see people are still coming in, people are still joining, but we said we'd kick off at 2, so we might just go straight into it. It's the title of this panel is Financing the Just Transition, but really I think we can consider it more as a conversation about how we implement a just transition. How do we move from the theory to the practice? From my perspective, a just transition isn't some add-on to climate action. It's the practical implementation of the social and the economic transformation we have to make in order to change our societies for the better, address inequality, protect workers, protect their communities, and mitigate or eliminate the negative aspects of climate policy so that we can ensure we avoid climate catastrophe and build public support. The just transition is something of huge complexity, so it has different facets, different aspects that all require deep consideration. So I'm really delighted to be joined by 4 experts with an array of backgrounds and who have been thinking deeply about environmental and social dimensions of policy making for a long time. Just briefly, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves, give us a minute, but first I'd just like to welcome each of you. We've got Sinéad Mercier, who is a researcher and consultant on just transition and rights-based approaches to climate action, and among many other achievements, was a key contributor to the Green Party's position on just transition. Bobby Lambert from Basic Income Ireland, Caroline Whyte from Feasta, the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability, and Paul Goldrick-Kelly of the Nevin Economic Research Institute. Guys, you're very welcome, all of you, and maybe sticking with that order, Sinead, Bobby, Caroline, and Paul, I might ask you guys to just give a 1-minute introduction, maybe a little bit about what brought you into this space of thinking about the social and economic challenges that lie ahead. Sinead, do you want to kick it off there?
Just starting with myself. Well, no more than yourself, Seán. You know, you've worked an awful lot on just transition as well. And I remember I think I actually came, that's how I met you first with the Mary Robinson Foundation. I came to you with a bill on just transition that I was writing for the Green Party. And I was hoping to get your input on it because you'd worked at an international level with the Paris Agreement negotiations and so on. So I think
we just ended up drinking a lot of beer.
Yeah, it was great fun. That was great fun. Best business meeting yet. So just similar to yourself, I come from this sort of, I suppose, having graduated out of law in Trinity, where you had a very kind of law obviously kind of has its rules and its place, and you graduate into the recession, and you realize that kind of legal system actually does have political underpinnings and is formed in a very political manner, and in fact in a style of economics that is no longer fit for purpose from ecological or social point of view. So I got very kind of involved in trade union kind of organising, especially with Dan O'Neill, who worked in Amnesty International at the time, where I was a unpaid intern, but they treated me very nicely and did pay me for other things. So I'm coming from that position, I suppose. For me, just like yourself, environmental activism is fit your future, that you can't disassociate it from wider ecological or economic backgrounds or purposes. So yeah, that would be myself.
Thank you, Sinead. Bobby, do you want to give us a few words on how you got into this area?
Good, pleasure to be here. Thanks very much. And yeah, I started writing down, I'm an engineer, and then linking to social justice. And actually, it's the other way around, because I remember one of the reasons I did engineering was because I saw it as a vehicle for being able to build a better world. And I think it still is. So that led me into working overseas with Concern initially, and then in humanitarian work, development and humanitarian work for a long time. And so that is, I suppose, broadly an arena of social justice on the globally. And then I also dipped my toes in quite a lot in environmental stuff. Karen Soar 1978 was one of my high points of my life, when we had the concert in Christy Moore playing Sacco and Vanzetti, and we stopped the nuclear power station, so that was great. And now, fast forward a little bit, jump over a few decades, I ended up as a joint coordinator of Basic Income Ireland, and I'm also a member of the Green Party, and on the majority left-wing side of the Green Party. I think we're possibly now, might say, I have to be a little bit careful about that. But as Sinéad said, I think these things go hand in hand. You're not going to get a proper green transition without a just transition. And it's great. It's great to see Just Transition. I'm delighted to be a member of Just Transition Greens. So that'll do for now.
Thanks, Bobby. Caroline, we might come to you next. And thanks for joining us.
Sure. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. Yep. So I'd echo what everyone else has said. I totally agree with what you just said about how a just transition it is the climate action, in the sense that it's making sure that climate action works for everybody, and that's just completely vital. Otherwise it doesn't count, obviously. And so I'm involved with Feasta, which is the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability, and the mission of Feasta is to try and identify the characteristics of a truly sustainable economy, and then disseminate them as widely as we can, what we find, what we discover. And we do a lot of partnerships with other groups as well. And it's on our website as well. Sustainability has to be for everyone, not just a certain little class of people, but everyone. It's really vital. So I have a master's in ecological economics, which is quite an unusual kind of economics. I'm sure a lot of people listening will know about this already, but it's a school of economics which doesn't consider growth to be vital, but instead focuses on adapting the economy to fit into to fit into the environment, basically. So it's a very different angle from neoclassical, or indeed a lot of mainstream economics. So it's a different kind of outlook. But we would also have a strong social consciousness as well. So, yep, and I'm very pleased to be here.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And last but not least, Paul. Paul's been doing phenomenal work with NERI on issues of just transition. It obviously gets very complex when you start talking about the workers both at risk and the potential for new work, and how to protect the rights and dignity of everyone. So, Paul, maybe you might give us a little bit of background on what you've been doing with NERI.
Thanks, Seán, and thanks for the invitation to speak to everyone. Yeah, so I'm an economist with the Nevin Economic Research Institute. We're a think tank that is affiliated with the trade unions but independent of them. And we exist really to kind of try and push the narrative a little bit, a narrative in Ireland hitherto that's pretty orthodox and pretty hostile, at least from our perspective, towards many of these angles, or at least would sort of the social justice aspect of things would sort of give that short shrift that's not kind of considered very seriously within economics much of the time. Before I went into just transition work, kind of given what was occurring in the policy world, I'd sort of dabble in a few issues, health and housing, but we sort of increasingly realized that just transition and the kind of the necessary transition in general, it touches on everything. It can't really be, it's both not its own, well, it sort of underpins everything. And we increasingly kind of saw that as a bit of a gap in our research. So I started doing that a bit. At the end of last year, we produced a paper on just transition. We were looking at the issues of who might be at risk, how you might manage it, etc. And I've done a bit of work since. That's going to really be my brief going forward. I'm starting a project with Maynooth that's going to look at the issue of carbon lock-in, which I'm looking forward to. So get my teeth stuck into that. But yeah, I feel really that this is the vital work that we have to be doing, just as progressives and within the labour movement in general.
Thanks a million, Paul, and it is great to have the labour movement represented here through you. So what we might do briefly before starting, just so you know, at the heart of the mission of the Just Transition Greens, and something that John Barry was very keen to emphasise when we were establishing, is the role of education. And so, Caroline, you mentioned that a lot of people might know. I would assume that you know, we're all here to learn from each other, so don't be afraid to spell out concepts, to talk through what you're talking about very clearly. And you know, there's very few in Ireland capable of giving a background and an overview of the Just Transition like Sinead. So maybe, Sinead, if you wouldn't mind taking 5 or 6 minutes, or maybe a little longer, just to give us your sort of 101 on the Just Transition.
Okay, thanks very much, Seán, and very interesting. It's great to have Bobby, Paul, and Caroline here, as well as yourself. I'm looking forward to the discussion as well with the others in the Q&A. But yeah, I suppose I'll give you a quick, what I found very interesting going through analysis.
Sorry, Sinead, just to jump in, you do have permission to share the screen if you want to.
Oh, do I? Okay, great.
Yeah, it's been changed, yeah.
But great. So I'll just give a very quick run through of the definition of just transition and where it's coming from. So, so just quickly, the word just transition, the phrase just transition as we understand it, has been popularized recently because of the Paris Agreement. So around 400 trade unions went to Paris in December 2015 to argue for this phrase here: take into account the imperatives of just transition in the workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. So this was a commitment from countries, 192 in the Paris Agreement, that when they were cutting emissions, they would do so in a manner that didn't leave people behind, that didn't end up with lower quality work or less quality, high quality jobs. And this was also part of a massive campaign by developing countries as well, to ensure that human rights and climate justice were within the Paris Agreement. So there's this very interesting kind of development in environmental law and climate law, which I suppose comes from kind of people seeking to be very urgent about climate action. But a lot of climate and environmental law is flexible. It's kind of based on kind of market mechanisms, this kind of approach that's about cost benefit analysis, cost effectiveness. It's very much kind of couched in the idea that human beings and their interaction with the environment is fundamentally damaging, that we will always damage the environment when we try to develop. So as Caroline spoke there, if development is based on the concept of growth and productivism, we will always damage the environment. So this is the kind of overarching idea. So what you have to do is that you have to balance development alongside environmental protection, and inevitably the environment tends to lose out, especially if you have kind of a very profit-based focus. But always from the very beginning of climate activism on an international scale, from the very underpinnings of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is sort of the overarching international treaty, from the very beginning, developing countries, those worst affected by climate change, wanted rights-based language. They wanted the language of inequality, they wanted the language of compensation, they wanted the rich globally, as well as rich countries, to take on climate action and to acknowledge the fact that they had contributed most to the current scenario. And we see that today with the loss and damage mechanism in the Paris Agreement. The US, even though it's pulled out of the Paris Agreement, they still want that kind of language of compensation and rights to be removed, because as we can see with the current climate case in Ireland, that institutes and a framework of accountability. So these kind of rich countries and rich wealthy populations don't want accountability. So just transition is part of this kind of fight back to reclaim the idea of green politics or green language, environmental language, and couch it in that language of equality and inequality, and the current dynamics that we're seeing on an international scale. So, for example, Oxfam has just recently put out a report showing that the 1% on an international level, the incredibly wealthy populations, they create as much climate pollution as the bottom 50% in terms of wealth. And we've also got recent studies coming out in Nature as well, which is a highly respected publication, showing that affluent populations globally, and Thomas Piketty has done work on an international carbon tax focused on internationally wealthy people. It has shown that these kind of wealthy populations in Ireland as well, what they do is that they invest their wealth into other damaging activities. So it's not only that they kind of live very high carbon lifestyles, so SUVs kind of flying around the world, yachts and so on, but they also invest their goods in their wealth, untaxed wealth as well, which Ireland again is part of as a kind of tax haven. That wealth is invested in, say, international investment funds like BlackRock, which have been shown to invest in oil and gas, though they promote themselves as green. So that kind of like need to talk about inequality is at the heart of a just transition. But it also has a very strong rooting in the trade union movement and workers' rights. So this is where the phrase of just transition comes from. It was popularized back in the 1970s by Tony Mazzocchi. So Bobby, you know yourself from Carnsore Point and that fantastic activism there, that a lot of oil, chemical and atomic workers, they worked in very poor quality conditions. They often went to work not knowing what they were being exposed to. A lot of kind of cancers, a lot of ailments in the community as well as the workers were showing up. And Tony Mazzocchi said that, yes, we have to move away from nuclear power. We have to move away to ban the nuclear bomb, but we must do in a way that doesn't leave these communities behind again, because they've already been exposed to kind of chemicals, already been exposed to very damaging substances. They shouldn't be subject again to a further kind of betrayal. And that kind of language is again here at the heart of kind of climate action. So I did a study with the National Economic and Social Council looking at 4 case studies of just transition in the Ruhr in Germany, in Lautz in Eastern Germany. I also looked at Australia and Scotland. And something that I just found again and again was that we had this wave of privatization in the 1980s and 1970s. Now, the history of that privatization was that it actually started during the IMF structural readjustment of Latin America in the 1970s, again, after a lot of them defaulted on their debt. So that kind of idea that you privatize and liberalize an energy system has political underpinnings. The first energy system that was privatized was Chile under the Pinochet dictatorship, completely against the will of the trade union movement and ordinary people in the country. And this wave of privatization across the world, it was kind of promoted as a way in energy systems to reduce costs and also be beneficial for the environment, because you would have renewable companies entering into the form. But that's not actually what happened in many cases. In many cases, privatization of energy systems led to, in the case studies I looked at, maybe kind of a huge drop in employment, around 90% drop, for example, in Germany and in Australia. And people felt that they had been completely left behind. And often environmental policies were then, they closely followed this privatization. So in Australia, for example, the Gillard Labour government, they brought in enough carbon taxes, they brought in an emissions trading scheme. They were hoping to kind of follow Europe by implementing the Kyoto Protocol, which is the predecessor to the Paris Agreement. But what happened was that that policy of an emissions trading scheme was accompanied by a 5 billion payout for coal companies and almost nothing for the local communities that were going to be badly affected by the closure of coal stations. And that led to great anger. The industry had already been privatized with a 90% drop in employment. These areas were already suffering from high suicide rates, kind of a loss of, they'd moved from kind of very proud working class communities to places that were called Doe Valley in reality TV series. That kind of sense of loss and failure and even trauma, as you can see here, was not really engaged with by the environmental movement at the time. It took a lot of work by trade unionists, by local people, by local businesses who act as intermediaries and promote this idea of a just transition, that you don't allow these things to happen again, that you allow people to transition into good jobs, into good quality employment. And this is where we find the Green New Deal, which takes inspiration from the New Deal under Roosevelt in the US. So there's a huge campaign in the US in particular around this idea of the Green New Deal, this idea that you don't leave people behind, like the Sustainable Development Goals. You bring those people with you, you see the skills and knowledge and experience that these workers have, and you allow them to promote that action. And then you also have the European Green Deal, which takes inspiration from this. Now, personally, I think that there's a bit of an issue with the focus on cost effectiveness before a just transition. Cost effectiveness, again, as Caroline will tell you, tends to be still connected to GDP rather than maybe a degrowth or alternative types of growth, well-being types of growth. But the European Green Deal does require Ireland, for example, under the National Energy and Climate Plan, to prepare a territorial just transition plan, which must be connected to a human rights framework, the European Social Pillar of Rights. So this is something that we will have to work on together as environmentalists and trade unionists. But it also has a wider perspective, just transition. It's careful to always foreground workers' rights in a transition. I think that's the most important thing. Obviously, trade unions campaign for wider control of the economy. Our economy has run riot with the environment and with social purposes. But there are other concerns that people do use the language of just transition to engage with, which is, for example, the right to freedom from energy poverty, the right to clean, free energy and on a human rights basis. And this is where we see the language of the Vincent de Paul talking about the need to stop energy poverty, the need to retrofit as many buildings as we can in a public manner rather than relying on private finances, because that's not feasible. And we also have the Irish Rural Link talking about this, and also the a big interesting focus that's kind of not looked at is the engagement of vulnerable populations in conversations around climate action. So until now, we've kind of, again, very much been wedded to that kind of market mechanisms, carbon tax, flexible mechanisms, cost-benefit analysis approach, which can be beneficial. But unfortunately, it's kind of dominated the debate to the point where you have kind of that kind of technocrat kind of focus over engaging with a public participatory approach, which means that vulnerable populations who will be worst affected by climate, like travellers, like workers in the Midlands, like people who live in very poor quality accommodation, renters, those voices have not been part of the conversation. Even from a female perspective, we've only had 2 women and 1 woman for a long time on the Climate Advisory Council, which is why it's dominated by a neoclassical focus. 77% of travellers who live in halting sites are currently in energy poverty. And this is a serious conversation we have to have about climate action. What is it? Is it just, or is it simply railroading through people that we need to bring the furthest behind first, which is the Sustainable Development Goals approach? So that's a quick overview, and I hope I'm within time. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a million, Sinead. That was great. A couple of things maybe that just from my own reflections on what you're speaking about there. It was interesting to hear you talk about the structural reform era. And I think one thing that many groups tried to draw attention to, both in the negotiations of the SDGs and the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, was the absolute emphasis on leveraging private sector capital, which is basically a euphemism for further privatization of entire sectors that are yet to be created. And you know, I guess this is where there's an inherent tension with the just transition, like between community ownership versus corporate ownership. And then I thought it was nice to see a picture of Ursula Rakova there, and is standing in front, you know, in that Climate Home article from the Cataract Islands. You know, putting the furthest behind first, whether that's globally in terms of living up to our own commitments for emissions mitigation that prevents the catastrophe, and locally, as you say, with including vulnerable voices, and your point about the Climate Advisory Council is very well made. We need more social scientists. We need more people who understand inequality on that panel, so that the advice reflects that. What we might do is jump into a few questions before opening it up to the Q&A. Guys, you all have an awful lot to contribute here, so if you can keep it to about 5 minutes, and then we'll try to bring everyone back in the conversations afterwards. But I might just start with Paul. You know, Sinead has given us a great overview there, Paul, but I know you've been digging into specifics with NERI around the mechanics of the just transition in Ireland and what it might mean for workers. Perhaps you could give us some insights into that.
Thanks, and thanks, Sinead, for a very interesting presentation there. Yeah, I think a kind of a crucial thing to kind of crucial sort of aspect of all this is that this, I suppose it's incorporated into the idea of a just transition itself, but that this needn't actually be a threat. Now, so given that kind of positive side, that this transition can actually help address many issues that Ireland has had, many long-standing issues that Ireland has had. So just to kind of refer to things even that led me into the just transition work. When you look at Ireland, I think this might be relevant in terms of even the discussion around GDP and the extent to which that actually reflects, particularly in the Irish case, any sort of success or well-being for huge swathes of our population. We have one of the highest rates of low pay in the OECD. If you look at the way Irish people are employed, and this is particularly an issue now given COVID, many Irish workers are concentrated in sectors with poor wages, poor conditions, no rights, no bargaining rights. And if you look at the economic data, it looks like actually those industries really can't ever support good living standards for the workers involved. There's a two-track economy on the island of Ireland, really. There's the multinational sector, and then there's the indigenous sector. And in many ways, they're quite separate, with outcomes for the workers involved pretty distinct. So the idea of the just transition, this could be actually the development model that Ireland has always called out for, in sort of addressing that middle section of jobs that really has never existed in Ireland, that kind of polarization, and addressing issues of low pay, that productivity that I was talking about, even, you know, the unevenness of regional development, how Dublin tends to suck in resources, whereas the rest of the country is underserved economically. And this sort of, you can actually sort of spin some of the negatives into positives with respect to the transition. Like when we looked at the composition of our workforce, there's actually a whole pool of underutilized skills in Ireland. So another aspect in which sort of our economy fails us is that there's enormous amounts of mismatching in skills in Ireland. There's a lot of people who are overqualified for the job that they do, and whose skills directly pertain to the sorts of things that we want to be doing for just transition. So there's a sense in which we can finally deploy the skills that we already have for better work and to advance just transition goals. We have limited amounts of in-job training. That's going to be something we have to address if jobs are going to change. To get into, I suppose, the specifics of the work we did, we were more looking at the most at-risk people. We looked at where are the majority of emissions concentrated in Ireland. Now, albeit there's complications with that. Some jobs that might not have much of a profile nationally in terms of emissions are dependent on carbon-intensive production elsewhere. But putting that aside just for a moment, about 90% of emissions come from about 5% of jobs in Ireland. So that's, or at least the emissions associated outside the household, that's associated with production, really. So that points to a cohort that we could use, we could sort of address. So to a certain extent, many people aren't going to be sort of at general risk of losing their job given this transition. So that's a positive side that must be emphasized. There's a limited cohort of workers that might need support. so that this transition is just. Indeed, those workers have a lot of skills that we could actually deploy them for towards better work. Now, in terms of what you'd have them do, in the context of even in COVID and the need for a back to work strategy, much of it are things that are already known to everybody. The low hanging fruit of the likes of an advanced and actually properly public retrofitting scheme. Currently, the retrofitting scheme has issues because it isn't in the form of an upfront grant. In many cases, it's actually just taken up by people who already would have the money to do so. So many people are actually unable to afford the kind of retrofits that we want. So properly addressing that could be a major way to sort issues of energy poverty, put people into employment, and address climate issues. We also have many kind of domestic advantages. When you think long-term steering the ship in a different direction, we have advantages such as tidal energy. We have some of the most abundant tidal resources in the world, really, in Ireland. It's sort of, if you looked at other countries such as, say, Denmark, they went into wind in a big way. And now they've captured aspects of that supply chain and they produce many of the components that go into turbines and such. So there's a way in which taking a lead on some piece of technology like that for the future actually sort of creates all jobs around, many jobs around it, many well-paid jobs, many union jobs. If only we really kind of allow the policy to sort of capture parts of those supply chains. Yeah, so in general, as I say, the point to stress really is that the Irish economy is already stratified. It already has issues with employment, with low pay, with employment for women. Actually, that's a major issue in Ireland, employment rates, even before this crisis struck. And now we have a crisis. So it's really screaming out to actually use this transition as the development strategy we've always needed.
Thank you very much, Paul. And that's a great way to finish. That's exactly it. It's a real opportunity for community-led development in many ways. And if we can envisage it as such, it could be transformative. We might dive over to Bobby. Bobby, representing Basic Income Ireland here. Clearly you're happy to see the universal basic income trial within the programme for government. Would you just be able to offer us some reflections on how you sense UBI and universal basic services can be leveraged to facilitate a just transition?
Okay, well, first of all, as you flagged at the beginning, Seán, I just should, maybe for people who are not quite so familiar, say what a universal basic income is. The U stands for two U's really, universal and unconditional. And this unconditionality to me is probably the most revolutionary and transformative aspect of the idea. Universal goes with it in that everybody would get it. It might be every citizen, it might be every resident. There's some discussion around that to make sure that everybody who is entitled to it in Ireland would get it. Basic means you can survive. There's a lot of discussion about that. Some people feel it should be 200 euros a week, some 300. We see with COVID payments, the discussion that can go on around that. It should be paid in cash, and it should be weekly, and it should be cradle to grave. There might be some adjustment for age in that older, pensioners might have a slightly higher need for cash than somebody than say children who are part of the household. But they're the basic elements of it. So that's what we're talking about. Now, in respect to universal basic services, Basic Income Ireland's position is that universal basic income should be one of a package of universal basic services. The others would cover, for example, a proper healthcare service free at the point of delivery, as broadly speaking, we're looking at in Sláinte care. It would also include, let's say, education, which should be properly free and seen as an investment rather than a cost. And access to housing, decent access to housing. So we see it as part of a package there, and that's what we're talking about. It's in the programme for government. It's there as a pilot or a trial. I think that would be good, but I think we should focus on the idea of a pilot. And I think we should see, as Just Transition Greens, this is it's a really great opportunity to have a major step forward here. And I think it gets easily overlooked. It hasn't had that much attention. Because if you can bring this in, it opens up so many of the points raised there that people were talking about, access to good jobs or good work that you might create yourself. You don't have to wait for somebody else to do it. It gives you freedom in bargaining to avoid bullshit jobs. So there are those sort of benefits. Now, there was just a point you raised there about financing it, and we're talking about financing it. There's a lot of sums have been done on this. A gross sum of, let's say, if we've 5 million and everybody gets 10,000 a year, you're looking at 50 billion, which is a big number. But that's the gross cost. The net cost would be much less because it would replace a lot of other payments. There would be, for a lot of people who are paying income tax, they would essentially net off because tax they might pay, additional tax they would get as UBI, or you might do it with a tax credit system. So I think on a bit of a back of a fag packet calculation, Aidan Regan recently came up with a figure of around 6 billion as a net cost, 5% of GNI. But I think that was even without looking at things like the benefits, because there's a stimulus benefit that people, low-income people who get cash, spend it in the local economy. Good or bad in terms of growth, but nevertheless, it goes around in terms of local economy. And I think there are things which show that this would just have direct economic benefits. But I think there's another benefit that is hard to put your finger on. And I don't like using the word, but the entrepreneurial benefit. And I don't mean entrepreneurial as in loads of money. I mean the ability to think beyond the current constraints of what is value. And we talk about work and we talk about jobs. To me, work is a bad thing. I'm an engineer. The less work, the better. We want more value for less work. Jobs is something, a job, why are we so hung up on jobs? Let's talk about money. Let's talk about value. Let's talk about quality of life. Robert Kennedy did this wonderfully in a speech many years ago. So I think that, and I think universal basic income gives people freedom. And I think that's a huge, huge part of it. I would like to see that we've got this opportunity now with the program for government. It's been pushed into the Low Pay Commission, which is not a very conducive environment for us. Our big fear is that this will be pushed into the long grass and become an experiment and it'll fade away. And I think that would be a huge shame because if we can move this along and get it in and see it, that the pilots should be pathways to implementation, not messing around looking at yet another study, because you don't do these studies when you want tax breaks for the rich. There's been enough studies done on this. I think we could really get behind that and push for it. And just to sort of maybe finish off, I spoke to my sister who's married to a farmer in Wexford. Sounds quite good, but they struggle. And I said, imagine if you had 200 euros a week, each person in your family, adult, you, Seán, Robert, who's at home at the moment, Sarah, who's studying, if you had 200 euros a week, unconditionally into your hand, what could you do? She said, can we have the pilot here, please, in Wexford? I think that liberating aspect and the unconditionality, even if it was a lower figure, I think the unconditionality aspect is huge. And I think the financing, going back to the overall financing of it, I mean, there are two broad mechanisms of where the money might come from. Social Justice Ireland have done the figures on the basis of income tax, but there are other possibilities such as a dividend on common assets such as the internet, and DiEM25 have looked at some of that. I think there's not much doubt that we can afford it. COVID has shown what we can afford when we decide we want to. And I think the benefits would be huge, and to me, a huge part of, a really practical part of just transition. Put the cash in people's hands and let them have the choice to work on things they want to work on. Okay, that'll do for me now. Get off my soapbox.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Bobby. It brings to mind the good fortune of interviewing a cultural anthropologist called Alf Holmberg, who some of you might know wrote the book Power of the Machine and has fantastic insights into ways we could think differently about the transition. One of the elements he thinks about with universal basic income is paying at least some of it in a local currency so that you properly throw a wrench into globalization and kind of encourage more local spending, which will democratize economies further. So there's huge potential, I guess. Caroline, coming to you, and Sinead touched on the European Green Deal in her presentation. We know that there's plenty good aspects, there's some concerning aspects in terms of you know, what it means, where the money will go, and who will genuinely benefit. If we come back to the kind of core definition of climate justice as sharing the benefits and burdens of climate change equitably and fairly, what would you see as, you know, if we wanted to change the European Green Deal towards explicitly that new Green Deal, or Green New Deal, Roosevelt-style tackling inequality and climate change simultaneously piece that Sinead spoke about. From Feasta's perspective, is there an innovative economic policy at the national level that could help advance this?
Thanks very much. Everybody hear me all right? There was a funny noise there. Yeah, great. Yeah, so I think, you know, there's plenty that can be done from a kind of financial policy aspect. And first of all, I really appreciate that you differentiate between the European Green Deal and a Green New Deal, which explicitly is focused on tackling inequality. Because I think the European Green Deal, as Sinead has already mentioned, it's very much in the mainstream economic thinking of, you know, the best way to make sure no one is left behind is to expand the overall economy. And in the aggregate, there's just so much evidence that aggregate green growth isn't possible. Green growth may well be possible in various sectors, you know, but in the aggregate, no, I don't think so. And more and more people don't think so. And, you know, so the focus needs to be really on sharing the wealth out. There's loads of wealth, needs to be shared better, and in a way that we really left behind. So I'm going to talk a little bit about money and how that could help.
Sorry, Caroline, you've just gone a little bit low there.
I have a headset if you need it. Is this
no, that's perfect. You're back again.
Thanks. So one of the reasons why there tends to be such a fixation on GDP growth is because we have a debt-based financial system that requires consistent aggregate growth in order to stay functional. And 97% of our money supply is created by commercial banks on the basis of interest-bearing loans. And that also has a very strong effect on inequality. And the late economist, Dr. Margaret Kennedy, calculated that the hidden cost of interest that has to be repaid on debts is roughly 45% of the cost of living overall. Another calculation she made, very interesting, she's in Germany, so she looked at German people. She figured that 80% of German people, those who have to work to get enough money to survive, pay more interest than they get from the system. The next 10% up break even, more or less. And then the top 10% get all of the leftover interest from the 80%. So they do really well off this. And it's probably a similar situation in Ireland. Another just little nugget is that if you have a 26-year mortgage at 6%, then you pay back as much in interest over that period as in the original loan. So, you know, we have a very odd financial system based on very, very heavily on debt. And wherever there's extreme inequality, there's also an extreme power imbalance. And you can see that very clearly in the way that banking is organised in Ireland. We have a handful of big commercial banks that have a lot of power and influence. Then you have the smaller credit unions, which are granted far less flexibility by the government. And as we all know, during the 2008 banks, the banks that were bailed out by the taxpayers because they were considered too big to fail. And that triggered austerity and a lot of suffering. And even now, in more normal times, banks are covered by a deposit insurance of 100,000 euros per person. And that effectively gives them a bit of a get out of jail free card, really, because it socializes the risks that the commercial banks are taking. So then the question is, can anything be done about this? I mean, there are reasons why there's deposit insurance, you know, obviously there are some good reasons. And Ireland is part of the Eurozone, and the government's ability, for example, to just start creating its own euros, it can't do that. It's not allowed. It's in the Eurozone, you know. So it's got its hands are somewhat tied, but there are things that can be done. There's a proposal that's been getting a lot of support in the Netherlands, which is also in the Eurozone, and it's got 100% consensus cross-party vote in the Dutch House of Representatives, and it's called safe haven banking. And this would be a publicly run bank or a set of accounts at the central bank. All the residents of the country would be entitled to an account, and a limited amount of their savings would be stored there, with a guarantee that they wouldn't be lent out, and it would provide a kind of safety cushion to prevent a panic in a scenario where there was a prolonged recession or a commercial bank crash. So effectively, it would convert any euros that were put into that account into a stable, debt-free version of themselves. And the account holders could take them out whenever they like, spend them, put them in another bank so they can be lent out, do whatever they like with them. But it would somewhat decouple debt from the system, not completely, but it would somewhat help to do that. And it would also enable a phasing out of the deposit insurance. And that would oblige the commercial banks to take full responsibility for their errors instead of passing the problems on to everybody in society, the problems that they create. So this safe haven banking, it would help to create conditions for a fairer banking system by making it more stable and preventing the likelihood of panicked and socially destructive behavior by creditors in a bank crash scenario, but it couldn't do the whole job of tackling debt by itself. And it would only have an indirect effect on inequality. So I'd see it as a necessary thing, but a preventative thing to prevent problems that could be brought in, that could happen if you bring in some other measures which aren't so new or innovative, but which are also extremely important. And I'll just quickly go through those. I know I don't have a lot of time. So the other measures I think are very important and are really about inequality. One is taxation reform. We need to place much greater emphasis on the taxation of unearned wealth, less taxation of labour. A land value tax is a very good example of that, and it has enormous potential for redistributing wealth more fairly. And it could be used, for example, to contribute to a universal basic income, to help with universal basic services, all of those things. There's also other kinds as well, of course, that could be introduced. We need a vibrant, second thing, we need a vibrant community or public banking sector, which would include credit unions. Public banking, despite its name, doesn't have to be owned by the state, but it does need to have a clear focus on the real economy of its community rather than on profit maximization. And it helps to address the destabilizing phenomenon that Feasta's late co-founder, Richard Douthwaite, described in one of his books, Short Circus. He wrote about how areas which are already wealthy tend to attract more money, while those which are deprived tend to get caught in a vicious circle, becoming poorer and poorer. The money kind of seeps away all the time. And community or public banking instead encourages money to stay in circulation within an area, rather than allowing it to leak away immediately to more affluent places. And there are plenty of examples to point to of countries with thriving community bank sectors. Denmark is a very interesting one because it has a network of banks which make interest-free loans, which is an interesting idea, particularly in a possible future where we won't have a consistently expanding economy. We might even have a shrinking one for a while. So, a third measure with a similar effect is complementary currencies. And there's been a bit of mention of that already, which is great. And these can be set up anywhere and everywhere by anyone. And they're designed to specifically encourage particular behavior or only be spent in a particular area. And their main drawback is probably that you can't pay taxes with them. However, if there's ever a financial emergency in Ireland, if that ever happens again, who knows, it would be very good for the government to have its own emergency complementary currency up its sleeve and ready to pull out when necessary. And finally, it would be also very good for the government, I'd say, to lobby at EU level for reforms in Eurozone policy so as to diminish the power of commercial banks throughout Europe and allow the money supply to become less growth dependent and more democratically determined. And Positive Money Europe has some very good ideas about that, including basic income or things very similar to basic income, but on a European level, that kind of thing. And I agree finally with Paul that this is actually a huge opportunity for change. And it's, you know, in some ways it's quite an exciting time. And that's it for now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, Caroline. That was a very substantial answer. There's, you know, a few elements that part of my own work is looking at community wealth building and looking at examples like the Preston model, where we can genuinely democratize economies. It's an exciting thing, I think, and something that if we could let it loose, it would allow climate action to be that engine of development that it can be, and expand people's capabilities to realize a just transition. Sinead, just really quickly, and this was a bit of a sneaky question that I added in because we were on a panel during the week, and I heard you make this point, and I thought it was a very valuable one. So just about, you know, he who pays the piper plays the tune. When it comes to financing a just transition, how important is it that you know, we acknowledge the power dynamics, and what are the risks of co-option in your view?
Yeah, I think it's something I've actually been thinking about quite a lot, the power, because the European Green Deal, as I'm sure Caroline will tell you as well, it's just interesting that kind of, I think co-option is unfortunately a big risk. We saw that with climate justice, the language of climate justice as well. It's also interesting with the language of just transition too, that it's kind of being thinned out away from its kind of workers' rights element. So really like a just transition kind of perspective of the Midlands, in my personal opinion, having read about it, would very much be about in line with the ILO kind of guidelines and the UNFCCC guidelines. You kind of have the government rolling up its sleeves and getting really stuck in negotiating kind of retirement policies and redeployment of workers, ensuring nobody has to be made redundant, that we actually use the skills of those peat workers to work in new industries. And that's kind of what has happened in the coal. So in the Ruhr in Germany, when they were phasing out coal, they phased out coal mining entirely by December 2018. And they did that by the very, very strong kind of social partnership, kind of the government, the coal industry, the steel companies and unions working together very, very strongly in these series of coal roundtables. And it's just interesting that that kind of is now absent. There's kind of like this vague idea of just transition and what does it mean, not being tied to its guidelines, which are internationally agreed upon by 192 countries. And yes, and it's similar as well with, I suppose, the language of public participation as well. So the climate dialogue that we had in the previous government, it was supposed to go around the country and kind of have these town hall style meetings. In the end, they only had 2, and the one in the Midlands, again, didn't actually make an effort to really bring in trade unions and also vulnerable populations. So this is a point that Diarmaid Torney, a great lecturer in climate policy, made me aware of. It didn't, when you have a representative sample of the population, you don't actually have the most marginalized, or as you yourself, Seán, say, the furthest behind first. So we know now that climate change will impact worst on those who we know are already marginalized. So it's going to be people who have disabilities, people who are travelers, women, particularly single parents. And those people are already in very shoddy accommodation, for example. A third of children in rental accommodation have kind of asthma difficulties, which Vincent de Paul has spoken about because of damp. And yet those people are not included in these climate dialogues or public participation measures. Yeah, so it's just, yeah, like that kind of, I think that that's something that we have to be very wary of, and it's continually happened on climate action. That kind of use of green ideas and green thinking, because you're speaking for an environment that can't speak for itself, it's easier to co-opt. And I suppose that's why expert analysis is so key, or public participation, local participation. The forestry bill is an interesting example of this dynamic again. So yeah, and in terms of financing on a broader scale, I think Caroline has spoken about it in a very good manner. Yeah, so.
Thanks, Sinead. No, I think what you say about participation is everything, really. Like, it's so easy to have a forum where people kind of nominate themselves, you know, they put themselves forward to participate. They always tend to be slightly better off, slightly better educated en masse, and so then you do miss out on true representation, and any thoughts or ideas or initiatives that emerge from those systems are designed to not reach, you know, respond to the needs of a certain cohort of people. Actually,
quickly, I just want to kind of point to, because I know it's live at the moment, like the concept of community energy. I think that's something as well to kind of discuss, you know, as Caroline and Bobby kind of spoke about, who is the community? I mean, is it wealthy people with resources who have the resources to invest in a wind farm? Or is it energy poverty and freedom from energy poverty for everyone in that area in a non-privatized, not-for-profit kind of manner? So there's a good example of the dynamic. The co-option of the word community is something to be very, very aware of and be careful with. Maybe a human rights framework, personally, I think is a good way to underpin it.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, there's some, you've probably come across it, there's some very interesting work done on Scotland in terms of that concept of community, and even the idea of, I think it's phrased as roll back and roll out, where you're seeing the roll back of public services and the roll out of kind of demanding volunteerism as sort of an implementation element of actions that should be really properly resourced by government sources. Guys, couple of things. We're 5 minutes from when this panel is supposed to end. If you have to jump off in 5 minutes, that's absolutely no problem. If you can stay on and address some of these questions, it would be appreciated twofold. First of all, the people who posed the questions, I'm sure would appreciate it, but also the counting of votes hasn't finished. So it would facilitate a smoother transition to the announcement of the results. I'm just going to spin down and ask questions as I see them, because part of the problem with Zoom is you can miss people's questions, so apologies if I do. Might just start with one question here, throw it out to the panel in general from Michael Rafferty, saying that part of the focus on private capital and solutions being central to the transition is the perception that the state as a poor planner is not capable of intervening on the scale necessary. Private capital funded transition will not, even with social mitigation, be a just transition. Isn't Ireland, as the most centralised state in the OECD, a case in point where the state can plan and finance through EU borrowing a just transition? I guess that's more a comment than a question, although there is question marks in it. But does anyone want to come in on that? And you know, this concept of, well, how do we deliver a just transition in an era of neoliberalism, I guess, is ultimately what he's getting at. Anyone feel like diving in there?
I could say something briefly. Yeah, I totally agree. It sounds, you know, it seems to me that Ireland is in a good position to do a lot of its own planning and effective planning. As I'm sure you know, there are concerns that any large organisation or institution, be it a state or corporation, can become too micromanaging, too, you know, controlling of individuals' lives, you know, and I think in some cases that can be a valid concern, and that's one reason why things like universal basic services and income are a good way forward as well, to give people more flexibility and more individual agency within a broader framework of good state planning.
Thanks, Caroline. Would anyone else like to, or will I jump on to the next question? I might just move on quickly. We have had a number of questions specific to presentations, but one is to you, Paul, regarding just what those jobs are. You mentioned a statistic of 90% of emissions come from 5% of jobs. I wonder, could you give us a little bit more detail about that?
Sure, and I should say that's about 9% of jobs. I misspoke there. So in our paper, we looked at, they call them NACE economic classifications. That's how they group jobs by sectors. So looking at the kind of the two-digit one, sort of showing you a little bit of detail below, you know, categories that say, you know, industry or manufacturing or something like that. The list that we came up with, I just have it here. So crop and animal production, hunting and related service activities, that will surprise no one. That's a little over a third of total emissions that weren't associated with households came from that sector. Air transport was huge, which that sort of raises kind of questions about the degree to which we sort of incentivize that kind of activity. So that's over a fifth of emissions come from that sector, and that only employs 0.5% of the aggregate sort of employment picture in the state. Electricity, gas and steam, that's another fifth. And then you have various manufacturing subsectors, non-metallic mineral products, we have manufacture of basic metals, etc. The kind of point being, and I wouldn't sort of, I wouldn't underemphasize the extent to which, you know, we need to be active to help these people and protect them. It shouldn't really be a policy. It shouldn't be implied by a policy ad, just, you know, let the cards fall where they may. It's more to say that actually in terms of the acute end, there's a lot of work you can do addressing a very kind of small percentage of jobs in terms of the aggregate carbon picture in the state. And you can be a bit smart about like where you might direct people to. If you know that these sectors are a problem and they're the sorts of sectors that will have to be shut down or at least, you know, substantially changed in their profiles and their activities, you can look at those people and see, okay, to what degree are they trained up in the kinds of jobs that we want. And that's, I suppose, a bit tangentially, but it relates to the point as well about sort of being specific and not allowing these terms. I guess when I refer to skills, you do note that everybody loves skills and the idea of upskilling. That's in no way controversial. Where you might get some pushback is the degree to which the state should actually shape the demand on the other end for that skills profile. And that's sort of related, say, to the Mazzucato image of the entrepreneurial state, that the state can actually play a big role in steering the ship, steering the economy, and actually go for something in a big way, rather than just saying, oh, well, the market will sort it out. And I mean, the extent to which, and I get concerned when we hear about transition plans where, what's suggested is call center jobs or something like that. Not to diminish working in a call center, I did myself, but that's, having worked there as well, you aren't treated very well working in a call center, and that's not really a plan. So that I just sort of put a proviso on my point there. That's also that paper, and a shortened version of that paper is available on our website, and I can direct you there if you want to look at some of the detail and some of the skills kind of aspects of things that we delved into.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you for addressing that. There's one further question. It's probably to you again, Paul, but anyone else who wants to jump in. It's just a question of the costs. So what are the costs, particularly the labour market costs in transitioning? That's a pretty all-encompassing question, but if anyone wants to give some thoughts on that. And there's another question here. It's a personal question really about moving from a prepay heat and power system, which is a higher unit cost, to a monthly or quarterly bill system, and yet there's a requirement to pay for that change. We seem to have, a very challenging, I would say, understanding of what energy is, and I would prefer to see it as a public good, but we're a while from getting to that. But any thoughts on the energy poverty issues and the barriers that, Sinead, obviously you've touched on energy poverty that is faced by the travelling community, but just, there's clearly a very serious interface here between climate policy and the well-being of people through the carbon tax. And so anything that you want to bring in on that would be valuable. And also, sorry, I'm just spinning down through these questions as they come up. Maybe we'll address those two and I can come back to the questions afterwards. So labour market costs and energy poverty. How do we transform our energy system so that we address energy poverty?
I don't know if we want to start with poverty or costs, or
someone dive in there and just take the floor.
I might take bite the bullet on the big question there, because that's a pretty expansive question. I guess I might put it, just even in terms of framing here, interventions for the labour market will need to be resourced, but this is ultimately something that we'll do for our benefit and to actively improve our lives. So rather than sort of buying into the framing all the time about something being X or costly, we might kind of consider it that way. But I mean, in terms of resources, it's interesting. Like we wrote the paper, and many of the kind of proposals that we put out there in terms of easing transitions. So say you have a situation where in one of these acute sectors, this has to go. This job is not tenable in the long term. Many of the proposals to sort of ease that transition are actually ones that they seemed odd at the end of 2019, but now given the context of coronavirus, they're pretty par of the course in terms of better, more extensive unemployment payments so that people can actually manage that transition. And particularly if we're talking about upskilling people, that actually have the resources and the capability to undertake that as an option. Many people, if you just sort of let them free to the whims of the market, they might not be able to undertake further education because they need money now, they need resources now. resourcing on those transitions for upskilling. And we make the point in the paper actually that there's a big pot of money, or at least like so on the tax side, Ireland is a low tax or low revenue country. Now the extent to which that's distributed is kind of the question. So if you actually look at taxes on, they call it taxes on labour. So you see the taxes sort of that are paid by workers, we're about average in European terms if you compare us to other comparably wealthy European countries. Where there's an enormous hole, billions hole, is employers' PRSI. Employers do not pay into a system where in other countries that those funds would go towards continuous training on the job, or in the likes of Sweden they have the jobs councils where coming redundancies are sort of addressed in advance, and you're placed into a course that's specific to you, and you're sort of maintained at an income to allow you to sort of undertake that decision. So I think those kinds of interventions are the kind of ones that we want to resource and we want to think about, and many of them, as I say, they've actually, the coronavirus has offered us something of a template of what to do when industries have to be shut down by choice. So we should sort of think in those terms, I suppose, I would say.
Thanks, Paul. Bobby and Sinead, do you want to come in there on either point?
I guess one of the things, as Paul says, we've learned an awful lot from the COVID situation about what can and can't be done. And an awful lot of what you're saying there resonates with the rationale for universal basic income for everybody, not just for, to allow people either to, because of jobs that may be going to disappear and people want to move quickly. If people want to educate themselves, they've got a universal basic income. We know some of the craziness to do with how we fund education at the moment, especially higher level education, and the sort of stupid hoops people have to jump through to get grants, or those silly ways in which they're stopped from getting them. So I think that's, it underlines.
You've gone on mute there, Bobby.
I've accidentally muted myself. It's on the table. This is something that's in the program for government. We need to push for it, guys. Okay, back off my soapbox.
Thanks, Bobby. Sinead, do you want to maybe come in on the fuel poverty point a little bit more?
Yeah, just quickly, just in relation to that issue there about the higher cost per unit when you prepay. So that is a kind of major issue for certainly people like who have lower wages or who will be in social housing. You would have kind of the meter in the house that you would put the pennies into to keep the energy costs going. So yeah, this kind of idea that you have a consumer-based tax or needs to kind of be addressed in a wider context, because I mean, as Paul kind of has noted there, this kind of disconnect, well not disconnect, sorry, but kind of the focus is on kind of skills, and the focus is on retraining and so on, and that's non-controversial. But then you kind of, this idea of the entrepreneurial state, that's actually something that came up in the studies that I did of Scotland for the National Economic and Social Council. Scotland has a huge oil and gas industry, so the North Sea, and Skills Development Scotland and other kind of state bodies, they did a lot of research on how the people who worked in oil and gas are easily transferable into offshore wind. Like the skills are almost kind of, in many ways, very, very similar, kind of offshore, kind of the harsh environment, undersea kind of engineering and so on. However, what happened, and what the oil and gas industry itself told me, was that they know that the game is up, and they know that they're going to have to phase out the North Sea. It's already depleting, and there was a major drop in employment from 2014 as well. However, the state is not rolling in behind it. So the UK government in Westminster is simply not investing in this kind of this new industry. They're not creating a publicly owned company to run the offshore wind. They're not taking kind of a state share, such as in Norway in their oil and gas. You have the situation of an entirely privatized industry And what happens is then you can't match up the local jobs with the local industry, because the local industry isn't local, it's owned by a multinational. And the wind turbines, instead of being built in Fife or being built in kind of shipyards or yards that are perfectly suited for building more steel and more kind of high intensity manufacturing, the wind turbines are shipped in from Indonesia to Fife and then planted there, and the local work isn't there. So this kind of idea that you can sit back and let the market can take its approach, or local jobs will somehow appear, it isn't true. And that's something that happened in the Ruhr in Germany in particular, where they noted that the coal and steel industry was being phased out. And if they tried to attract foreign businesses or take a foreign direct investment approach, they would end up with call centers, they would end up with very low quality jobs, because these were highly skilled, highly paid, unionized workers. They would have to look in their own pool to develop their own industry and take that kind of approach. And I fear that we have a situation here with energy efficiency in particular. We have the highest rate of energy poverty in Europe. We have very, very low quality housing, particularly because of the boom. We also have a lot of housing dependent on oil-fired heating. My own house here, well, not my house, but my my family home, and also turf as well. And we need to have kind of a frank conversation that energy efficiency is not in line with a growth-based approach to climate action. You can't sit back and say, oh, the jobs will magically appear, because energy efficiency commitments at EU level are voluntary. And we also, they're not the same as the climate commitments, which are attached with fines. We also have a scenario where the energy system is privatized in many parts of Europe. So there isn't this kind of drive to be energy efficient, because your drive is to have profit and to maximize costs. So personally, we need to take this kind of mazzucato, this kind of very entrepreneurial state approach. I have a book here of the rural electrification scheme in Ireland, back at the found in the state, where we have to admit, well, it's not going to profit. There's never going to be a profit. We have people who are suffering, just like Ben has mentioned here. We need to now drive this investment and have a public retrofitting approach all across the state. And it must be public, because it's just never going to happen. The Department of Finance itself and Freedom of Information requests have shown that the climate action plan focus on retrofitting 500,000 homes is madness. It's just never going to happen. So it has to be publicly driven, and it'd be a much better world. It's a difficult conversation and difficult way to do it, but hopefully.
But the beautiful thing about it being, if it was publicly driven, is that you have an influenceable spend there that you're able to channel into, whether it's workers' cooperatives or local SMEs, that keeps the wealth local. And it's back to what Caroline was saying earlier about localized economies. So I think maybe what we might do is maybe sum up now and take a quick break before the return of voting. I'd like to first of all say thank you very much. There's some questions that I've missed, and you can see them there, guys. So if there's any you want to address in final remarks, do. But I just want to put one question to you as a closer, and just to get your impression on it. I was speaking to two policy experts yesterday who are heavily involved in the creation of the Just Transition Mechanism, which is part of the EU Green Deal. And we were talking about how we might embed bottom-up policy making into this mechanism. Now, the funding for the Just Transition Mechanism could come online as early as January or February of 2021. So there's a real opportunity, but also there's a very big gap between those making those designing the mechanism in Brussels and communities experiencing the challenges of daily life here in Ireland. So just from your own impressions, what do you think? It's messy. You can have a line on a paper that sounds very nice. You can have lines in the Paris Agreement that sounds very nice, but actually the implementation of all of this is incredibly difficult. There's a lot of heavy lifting. From your perspective, coming from where you're coming from, what do you think are the key elements in implementation? I'd just like to ask each of you, and we might go with the reverse order that you all introduced yourselves in. So I might start with you, Paul, and just ask, what do you think, if the people leaving this chat today, there was a fundamental thought or concept you'd like them to take away about the just transition, what would that be?
Interesting question. I guess really the kind of preface the comment you're making about the funding for participation. I guess it won't surprise you that my viewpoint would say that workers and their representatives have to be involved, particularly if we're going to ask them their lives to fundamentally change, or they're going to have to lose their job. They have to be involved at the planning phase, and we have to have this in a planned as opposed to reactive manner. We can't kind of abide policy that's going to go scrambling after a planning decision that could have been fairly, that could have potentially been seen or planned out. They have to take a proactive approach to these things, and what you're going to do and how we're going to manage transitions for people, as opposed to trying to clean up a mess after the fact. And so I suppose in taking away, we workers, the people affected, we have to be involved in the planning from the very beginning.
Thank you very much, Paul. Caroline, do you have any closing thoughts on the fundamentals of a just transition?
Well, if there's one thing, sorry, just to start with, the second kind of question you had was about what would I'd like people to think as they leave here. Just to think about the role of debt in the economy, and that question earlier about how much it will cost to bring about the just transition. I think it's helpful to think about how much of that cost is debt, and rather think and whether it has to be that way, whether it could be another way, and also to think of it as an investment rather than just a cost, as something towards the future, not just money that disappears. I think it's good to frame it in a different way, it's helpful. And then in terms of participation, I absolutely agree with Paul. I think there's a way has to be found to bring in everyone. And I hope I'm not going to preempt what Bobby's going to say, but I do think that giving people a basic income or giving people a means where they have a bit of headspace to attend meetings and think and plan for the future is very important, because I know myself and I know a lot of people have so much going on, and if you're already under financial stress, and then you're expected to participate in all these meetings and so on, it's a bit of a head wrecker. So it's really good to provide resources and space for that, I would say. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Caroline. And yeah, dealing with people's lived experience and making sure participation can happen around their terms is so important. I'll go to Bobby and then we'll finish off with Sinead. Good news, I think the votes are ready to be announced, so we won't need to take that break after all. Bobby, would you like to give us some final thoughts?
Surprise. Well, I guess a key element, as I've said before, is the universal basic income. And it's to do with the money. Get the money out to people. Then people can, there's lots of things we can look at. And I think Caroline and myself have had other discussions where we kind of agree that there's a pathway here from where we are to where we want to be. And I think one of the first steps on that pathway that's up in front of us right now is universal basic income. We struggled for so long to get this on the agenda. It's in the programme for government. It's Green Party policy. It's absolutely aligned with just transition thinking, linked for the universal basic services, of course. Let's push for that. And then we can also liberate so many people and give them the capability to work for even more of these changes that we need. So in a way, to summarize, I suppose you call it a safety net for those of us see how much we need a safety net with the COVID crisis. Is also a platform for success, and success in terms of a successful society, not just a successful competitive economy, a society that works for all of us. So there it is. Let's go for that one as a big stepping stone in front of us.
Bobby, thank you very much. Sinead, we'll finish off with you, just your own reflections on what is fundamental to a just transition.
I suppose I think the fundamental part of it is meaningful participation and meaningful engagement of all perspectives. When I did my master's in the London School of Economics, it was recent enough after the economic crash, And we took part in an occupation of the university, protesting the style of economics that was being taught, because kind of ecological economics or feminist economics, or even kind of approaches that weren't the kind of neoliberal one that we have, which caused the crash and has caused our current climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and the cycles of privatization and human suffering that I've spoken about as well. And it was very interesting because it was kind of this weird scenario where the university itself and even the provost didn't disagree with us. And neither most of the academics, and some of the academics had actually started to integrate those new perspectives into their work. But it's interesting how that process of co-option, or process of, okay, that's very nice and that's very thoughtful, but this is what's making us money right now, and this is short-termist, and this is what we see in front of us, this is what we know how to do. We'll just continue with that. And I think, yes, there are ways that we need to step back and allow different ways of seeing and different ways of thinking through maybe a universal basic services or universal basic income kind of approach, allow people that headspace. But I think there must be a strong underpinning to just transition and climate justice. We need to develop guidelines, we need to develop a very strong kind of human rights-based approach to this. So for example, the donut economics that's kind of spoken an awful lot about. It's gaining traction. It's also mentioned in the European Green Deal. However, the European Green Deal, in the same kind of few pages as mentioning a just transition and donut economics, it still is tied to cost effectiveness in the overall approach to the Treaty of the Function of the European Union, and sustainable development in the language of kind of financial sustainability. It's not about environmental sustainability. So I feel that kind of we need a clear-eyed approach to that kind of language, and the need to redefine and take control of green politics and green environmentalism, and attach it to kind of a clearer underpinning of rights, and understand that human beings are not damaging to the environment. We are part of the same circle, which Lorna Bogue spoke about earlier as well. So yeah, that's my kind of, I suppose, final thoughts. But I feel it's very positive. I feel that there's I think the climate case, I feel that a lot of kind of organizations that did not feel comfortable in this space before, like travellers' rights organizations or migrant rights or trade unions, they really feel part of it. I mean, Paul's work is brilliant, along with Ciarán Nugent as well. And I think that's very, very exciting. And I feel that we need to run with this wave, and we'll surf with the wave is probably the better one. So.
That's fantastic, Sinead. Thank you very much. Maybe just to sum up, and we'll pass on then to Dominic Donnelly for the results of the vote. I'd just like to say thank you all very much for your contributions. I think the messages are coming both to my phone and in the chats. People have really valued this conversation, so thank you very much. It's one thing that strikes me about all of this is how immediately personal and interpersonal this transition is. It's about looking after each other. And there's a line in the Whitlam plan. Gough Whitlam, who was Prime Minister of Australia for a single term, I think, on account of how ambitious his plan for equality was. He had a line that said his ambition was to promote equality, involve the people in the decision-making processes of the land, to liberate their talents and uplift their horizons. And I think if that was the ambition of a Green New Deal, or the ambition of a just transition, to genuinely liberate the talents of our communities and give everyone, as you know, as Anthony and Eileen were saying earlier, the genuinely uplifting the horizons of everyone, so that politics is the domain of all people of Ireland, and our ownership of our resources is the domain of all people of Ireland, then we're beginning to do something transformative. So thank you all very much. We will continue this conversation. This is only the beginning, and I'm handing over to Dominic now for the results.
Great. Thanks so much, Seán. That was great.
Bye, guys.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Okay.